Linda Reynolds is quite right. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is unsustainable in its current form, but the necessity for change won't make achieving it any easier. Because the way the NDIS was set up, change just doesn't require the passage of legislation through the Senate. It also requires the agreement of the states. For years, people with a disability needing services to help with daily life depended upon their families, whatever they could afford, or what the state government would provide them. Hence the NDIS, the product of a long lobbying campaign, mostly by the parents of children with a disability, for services tailored to people's individual needs rather than set by limited state government budgets. Instead of queuing for services that were never adequate, the idea was that everyone with a serious disability would be individually assessed and allocated individual funding packages that families or case managers could then spend to obtain the services their loved ones needed. For people with severe disabilities, funding could amount to several hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It could include daily personal activities, transport and mobility, access to work and education, household tasks, home and vehicle modification, therapeutic support. A government website says the NDIS funding could cover things like getting and keeping a job, making friends, or participating in local community activities. Although originally intended for the approximately 400,000 Australians whose disabilities meant they needed serious help with everyday life, not the estimated 4 million with some lower level of disability, there's been understandable pressure to broaden eligibility on the grounds of fairness, as those on the scheme get tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in funding, or those who are not on the scheme have had to make do with what they could get elsewhere, through the health system, for instance, or pay for it themselves. Now, in principle, who could deny people with disabilities the services they need to live a decent life? Which is why the NDIS began with bipartisan support back in 2013. But in practice, it was always going to be a struggle to keep the costs down, quality up, and eligibility under control. Hence the Minister's warning today that costs are increasing by 12% per year. It's almost 5 times more than inflation, and likely to grow from a massive enough $25 billion a year to as much as $60 billion a year within the decade. As well, a scheme that was originally funded 50-50 between the Commonwealth and the states is steadily falling more heavily on the Commonwealth, because the original Gillard-era funding arrangement capped the state's cost increases to 4%, with the rest borne by the Commonwealth. Hence, federal taxpayers' share of total funding of the NDIS will hit 60% within 5 years. A 2019 report recommended that more funding decisions be made by government specialists rather than the doctors of the beneficiaries. But a trial of this concept has been vetoed by the states. Now legislation to give the NDIS CEO more power to limit beneficiaries' funding is in trouble, in a Senate more concerned with the rights of beneficiaries than the burdens on taxpayers. I don't pretend any of this is easy, but for the grace of God, there go you and I. And there's always been a tension between what the government might be expected to pay for in an ideal world and what taxpayers can readily be expected to fund. But it's always worse when the costs fall disproportionately on different levels of government. And having government-funded bodies managed through more or less independent agencies where the entity spending the money is not the entity raising it. It's usually then asking for trouble. On balance, the NDIS has succeeded in its aim that the lives of people with a disability are better than they would otherwise be without the NDIS. But it's no insurance scheme as it was promised. It's one of the reasons why your tax bill is so high and why government is so hard.